Shall we get started?
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, welcome everyone to the discussion today, our roundtable discussion on South Africa's energy system and opportunities and challenges in the just energy transition in South Africa. I'm Jared Starr. I'm the Associate Director with the Energy Transition Institute here at campus, and I welcome you all here. All right, so at the Energy Transition Institute, I just want to kind of quickly give you a very brief overview of what we do. At ETI, we see a need and many opportunities in this transition towards renewable energies, for this transition to be sustainable and equitable. But we don't believe that that outcome is necessarily guaranteed. It takes work to ensure outcomes of equity and sustainability in this transition. And so that's what ETI is focused on doing. And we do that through combining research and education. And we do that at the intersection of energy technology and social justice. So that involves events like we're having today. We try to bring folks from around campus together, make these connections between scholars from different parts of campus to lead to interesting discussions and also opportunities to further research. And so we put on different events and we try to bring folks together. I'll have a little slide at the end if you want to get involved with ETI. I've got my contact information up there. You can send me an email if you're a researcher or grad student that wants to get more involved. Please contact me. All right, just to get a sense of how effective we are at bringing folks together from around campus, I'd like to do a quick poll of where folks are affiliated, just so we kind of have an idea of where folks are coming from. So if you're from College of Engineering, let's say, can I just see a show of hands? Who's from College of Engineering? We've got about maybe 6. How about Humanities and Fine Arts? Okay, about equal number from there. That's cool. Information and Computer Science? All right, very good, thank you. CNS, any folks from CNS?
Nope.
No?
Really?
All right. Where are they? How about SBS, anyone from SBS? Okay, great, nice turnout. About 7 maybe?
Yeah.
Public policy? I know people have some dual affiliations. Okay, 2 from there. School of Earth and Sustainability, folks affiliated with that? Okay, anyone else that I've missed? I've got some other ones up there. Anyone else? Different affiliations?
And some guests, right?
And our guests from Egypt. Yes, welcome. Okay. Well, thanks. That gives us a sense of how we're engaging with people. It's nice that we've got a mix of folks from around campus today. Should lead to an interesting discussion. All right. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, James Boyce. He's a professor emeritus in economics here. He has a long career of publishing, both in scholarly works and also many, many books focused on inequality, climate change, economics, economics in developing countries, and some of that work is also focused on Africa. And so we're really honored and happy to have Jim here as our moderator. We're in good hands.
Well, thank you all for being here today. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to this event. And please grab a chair where there's some extras over here.
The table.
Before I start introducing our speakers, I'll just say a word about how this event came to be, which was that back in July, Michael Ash, my colleague over there, sent around an article that had appeared in the Financial Times describing what was presented as sort of a disastrous rollout of a major piece of the energy transition in South Africa. The South African electricity system is heavily dependent on coal. And in 2022, as a step towards transitioning away from coal, the government had shut down the biggest coal-fired power plant in the country, the Komati plant. And the idea was to repurpose that and move it to solar and wind and so on. And it all sounded like, you know, the clean energy transition. South Africa is a significant producer of greenhouse gases. I think it's maybe number 11 in the world. Does that sound right? And so there's a lot of international support for moving this forward. The World Bank had ponied up, I think, around $500 million to assist in the transition of this plant. That's part of a larger package put together by some of the main donors, amounting to about $9 billion. And so this was all had begun. And the result was described by the head of Eskom, what used to be called the Electricity Supply Commission of South Africa, the public electricity utility, as being like an atomic bomb hitting the local community, because the community had been built around the plant. People were dependent on that plant for jobs, and there had not been apparently much, if any, thinking about what these people who had been working in the coal plant were now going to do when the coal plant shut down. And this produced such a reaction that in the end, the government delayed its plans to close its other coal-fired power plants, and a whole discussion began, not only in the South African government, but with the donors, about how to make sure that in the future, the transition would be a just transition in the specific sense that it paid attention to the livelihoods of people who had been dependent on the old fossil fuel generated power supply system, and make sure that they weren't made worse off in the course of this transition. So that was what the article described. And when Michael sent it around, several of us kind of weighed in and said, well, there's a lot of background to what goes on in the South African electricity supply system, a lot of institutional background about Eskom in particular, and a few more things maybe need to be said than what appeared in the FT article. So that was how the panel got put together. So I will introduce each of our speakers in turn. They've each been told to speak for about 8 minutes. Jared here is going to do his best to enforce that, bearing in mind that we are dealing with people who are professors here. But we will try to keep the presentations relatively brief, with the idea being that then we can have discussion, questions. Others may want to add things to what's been said. So to start out with, we have John Higginson on my left, who is Professor Emeritus of History here at UMass. He's conducted extensive research in South Africa. His most recent book is called Collective Violence and the Agrarian Origins of South African Apartheid, 1900 to 1948, published by Cambridge University Press. His latest article, which he just sent me a few days ago, and I assume just came out, was published in the journal Comparative Studies in Society and History, and it's titled, If Your Ox Does Not Pull, What Are You Going to Do? Persistent Violence in South Africa's Deep-Level Gold Mines and Its Contribution to the 1922 Rand Rebellion. His current book in progress is called The Hidden Cost of Industrialization, State Violence and the Economic Transformation of Southern Africa, 1900 to 1980. So, John, over to you.
Thank you for that generous introduction, Jim. I'm going to try to stay within the limits of the timekeeper's constraints, and so I'll start right in. In South Africa, under the pre-1948 segregation governments and the 1948 to 1994 apartheid governments, the use of electrical power was reserved for the white population of the cities and towns, primarily. Electrification in South Africa began once its gold mines became the largest supplier of gold for the global economy at the beginning of the 20th century, at the end of the horrible South African War of 1899-1902. Electrification started in the mines and spread to the non-mining population between 1902 and 1914. But electrification and technical innovation did not mean less work for Africans who worked in the mines, particularly those people who were known as lashers or shovelers. Rather, the amount of ore to be shoveled into the ore cars increased in terms of amount and frequency as well, going from 10 to 15 seconds per shift by 1914. The net result of that was a lot of death and a lot of mortality. And if Jared, could you show the slide of Herbert Hoover and William Hanold counting the dead and the maimed at the East Rand proprietary mine in 1904. Herbert Hoover, as most of you know, became the president of the United States on the eve of the Depression. But he also worked for 4 years in South Africa's gold mines as well. So from 1972, I'm going to skip in time pretty rapidly here. From 1972 to 1984, as protests against apartheid assumed popular proportions, some of you, well, no one in this room except for us oldsters will remember the wave of protests that began in 72, 73 in the textile mills of Natal and moved to virtually every workplace in South Africa, and finally to the young people, to the students, in the form of the Soweto uprisings. So from 1972 to 1984, 85, when the South African state under the National Party imposed a state of emergency on the country, the apartheid state and the National Party bestowed electrical power on the poorer white farmers in the Western Transvaal and the Northeastern Orange Free State to keep them within the National Party voting bloc. Because in addition to the popular protests, there emerged a series of parties, fascist parties, even more fascist, let us say, than the National Party. After 1982, the Conservative Party, the Afrikaner Volksfront, and so on, the Afrikaner Weerstandsbeweging, the Armed Afrikaner group emerged, and the clerk and earlier Forster and Butcher had to keep these white farmers in particular within the National Party voting bloc once these outrightly fascist parties emerged. And one way they did that, of course, was to provide electricity to the poorer farmers in the most outside regions of the Orange Free State and the Transvaal. Ironically, most of the state electrical companies' power stations were located in the black townships of the country's cities and towns. Jared, if you could show the slide of Port Elizabeth. Well, I'm skipping here. We'll come back to this perhaps in discussion here moment. Yeah, there we go. So in spite of the fact that the power stations, most of the power stations were located in the black townships, this is what the black majority had to come to terms with in terms of living in the country. Because the African National Congress came to power as a result of a negotiated settlement, and we can talk about that. 2 more minutes, okay. It came to power as a result of a negotiated settlement with the National Party. It had neither the mandate nor wherewithal to change the old arrangement for the first decade of its tenure. Jared, if you could go back to the school slides. This is what I've called a generic public school in Port Elizabeth in 2007. The young people here call these things on their laptops. And could you show this slide of the Model C? And these are the Model C public schools. Basically, the schools that were all white before, under apartheid, and which presently many Black students who are there have had their families have had to sacrifice on a scale unimaginable to someone in the global north to keep them there. But as you can see, this doesn't make this kind of disparity in terms of education doesn't make for a lot of Black engineers and scientists. And unfortunately, the ANC governments, the first ANC governments, were unable, for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about, to do anything about that. At the outset of South Africa's deindustrialization in the mid-1990s and the 2006-2008 recession/depression, the limitations of the ANC's capacity to govern bred widespread cynicism among its leadership, which in turn led to a paralysis of policy decisions. Some of you remember that horrible instance of textbooks molding in warehouses under Zuma, and the excesses and the other excesses of the Zuma era. Also, even among those who were not caught up, even among that portion of leadership that was not caught up in the corruption. I'm thinking now of someone like Gwede Mantashe, the Minister of Energy. There was a resistance to shift away from coal, and that bears more discussion, which we will have later, subsequently, I'm sure. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Sindiso Mnisi Weeks. She is an associate professor of political science and legal studies here at UMass. She received her doctorate in law from the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. And in addition to teaching here in poli-sci and legal studies, she's an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Public Law at the University of Cape Town in South Africa, where she received her BA and LLB degrees. Among other work, she's the author of the book Access to Justice and Human Security, Cultural Contradictions in Rural South Africa, and co-author of the forthcoming book, The Rule of Law in South Africa. So let me hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the organizers for this invitation. So I'm going to take Erin's advice very seriously, because as somebody who doesn't actually focus on energy, I think my job here is to sort of give a little bit of perspective from the ground. So I'm a legal ethnographer, social and cultural ethnographer. And so I'm going to speak from that positionality. I also grew up in South Africa. And so, you know, when John was talking about the giant-sized coal-powered plants that were placed in townships, I grew up in South Africa's largest township, the southwestern townships of that are at least abbreviated Soweto. And so I actually grew up in the shadow of one of those large coal-powered plants that now is actually quite spectacular in terms of the ways in which it has been converted by art and graffiti in order to make it look really colorful and beautiful, even as, you know, the reality of all of the soot that came out of there in order to power the white suburbs of South Africa lives on in people's lives. And so, you know, I still have lots of relatives who live in Soweto. And when the COVID pandemic hit, you know, most of those people actually were hospitalized because of the effects of living in the shadow of the coal-powered plant. I also have family from Mpumalanga, South Africa. So if you go from Johannesburg and you sort of drive northeast, Mpumalanga literally means the place where the sun rises. And it's one of the 9 provinces of South Africa. And so my father's family comes from there, and the area in Eswatini, as well as surrounds on the South African side of the colonial Berlin Wall, Berlin Treaty borders, right? And that is actually coal country. And so, when we went back after COVID, my family and I, my US now family and I guess, and we're driving from Johannesburg, where, my mother lives, to Mpumalanga, where my father had been buried during the pandemic. We were driving through coal country, and it was so evocative because I grew up driving that distance, right? Like 3.5 hours this way, 3.5 hours that way. And one of the smells I most distinctly associate with that place is that heavy soot smell, right? Of like coal just being like, churned out at like ridiculous rates in order to power the energy system. And in this instance, I was recognizing that, but I was also seeing something I hadn't seen before, and that was coal trucks, like truck upon truck upon truck, just like driving the highways, blocking the way as, people were making their way from one province to the next, transporting coal. So this is coal that, and I think you're going to talk about corruption, so I'll save that for you. But, tender deals and that sort of thing that has produced a system in which, ESCOM generates and transports this coal that should really be transported, I guess, by train tracks, if it is going to be transported at all. And as you pointed out, right, ideally, we wouldn't be coal dependent or coal-powered energy dependent anymore. But if it is going to happen, one would think that it would happen in a much more efficient and less disruptive way than trucks, like rows and rows and rows of trucks on the highway transporting coal from one point to the next. The other thing I wanted to share, I guess, is that, one of the things I think about I've lived here since 2013, so 11 years now, and I've had one power outage in the whole time that I've lived here. Granted, I chose not to live in the woods. As a person who grew up under apartheid South Africa, I'm like, yeah, no, sorry, I'm good, thank you. And in a country where people own guns, I'm like, yeah, no, thanks, I'm good. Speaking of the AWB, right? Like, that's my association of people in the country who own guns, right? But that aside, right? Once, right? When I go to Johannesburg or Cape Town, which is where I spent most of the bulk of, the last 2 decades of my life, I think about electricity all the time. It's like a pervasive part of your existence in South Africa, right? Yeah. So you're thinking about, okay, so what's the load shedding schedule? Load shedding being a euphemism for power outages, right? So they're shifting power outages from one neighborhood to the next in order to manage the energy distribution, right? And availability, because we don't have enough energy available, right? Thinking about that. I'm thinking about, will I be able to conduct my meeting in the time when my meeting is scheduled, right? Will I be able to cook at the time when I need to be able to cook for my kids because, load shedding, right? I'm thinking about, is this a restaurant where I want to dine? Because, I don't know if their food is safe because they may not have a backup generator that's actually going to, be able to keep the food refrigerated, right? And I don't want to get sick, and I don't want my kids to get sick, right? I'm thinking about, is this a grocery store where I want to shop for very similar reasons, right? I'm thinking about energy all the time. And that's just such a different existence, right? And the work that I do, and I will end here, thank you. The work that I do is look at the relationship between indigenous systems of law and state law in South Africa. And one of the things that stands out in my mind a lot, because, the communities that we work with are communities that are protesting against government regulations that are put in place under the auspices of tradition, culture, reclaiming our identities from colonialism, our traditional leaders as the custodians of our culture, but actually are a cover for the kinds of corruption that are embedded in the ways in which traditional leaders, especially in the vast parts of the land that have tremendous resources, right? Like platinum, the platinum belt, gold, coal, whatever, right? They are in cahoots with the lawyers, the big law firms, with the accounting firms, with the government Department of Land Affairs, what used to be Land Affairs and is now Rural Development and Land Reform, although there isn't that much land reform happening, and minerals and resources, right? And so all of those relationships results in a lot of protest from our partners trying to fight against the extractive industries, like the complex, right? The extractive industry complex that we have in South Africa, and the reality of what that means for people's day-to-day existence. And the statistic that I think of a lot is that at least when I was last in South Africa, it was like 38% of government is vacant. So 38% of positions in government are vacant. And you think about what that means for your ability to govern, right? And your ability to make progress on things as critical as the energy transition and making it a just energy transition. And one of the consequences is that people, John showed the image of people in the townships, thank you, people in the townships or informal settlements. Those people, a lot of fires, right, from trying to steal electricity because they don't have it, or because the meters, if you're in a house that's like one of those government houses that's sponsored, right, you have a meter, and that meter, like if you don't have electricity, like you can't cook, you can't do the things that you need to do to survive. And so people steal electricity, and that's dangerous, right? And so people die. And so thinking about all of those realities and then going to the suburbs and seeing how many solar panels there are. And the reality that, so I just, to be transparent, my husband actually works in the solar industry here. And he tells me that when he does the mapping, South Africa's solar potential is like 2 or 3 times what we have here, right? And so for the same panels, the same sort of investment, upfront investment, you get like 2 or 3 times the return, right? And yet what's happening for people is that that's going to people all in the suburbs, and they're coming off the grid, and that's taking money and resources away from the public infrastructure. And so the problem sort of perpetuates itself. And so I think that's a good point at which to hand over to Erin and Léonce to share what they're thinking. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, to further complicate the story, we'll now turn to Erin Baker. She is a distinguished professor of mechanical and industrial engineering here at UMass and the director of the Energy Transition Institute, the group that's sponsoring today's panel. She received her PhD at Stanford. Her research is in decision-making under uncertainty, where now we're seeing a lot more dimensions of uncertainty already in the South African context, applied to the field of energy and the environment with a focus on how to build a just and equitable energy system in the face of climate change. In the early 1990s, she lived in Africa in northern Ghana, an experience that it sounds like helped her to tune into some of the pervasive inequities in energy systems in Africa and elsewhere, as she recounts in her 2021 TEDx talk, which you can see on YouTube. So let me hand it over to you, Erin.
All right, thank you. So my expertise is on energy systems and electricity. I've done a teeny bit of work in Africa, and what I'm going to talk about today was actually a month-long research visit to visit a friend of Léonce's, Edwin Muchipanda, at University of Cape Town, where I interviewed a number of stakeholders of all different parts of the energy system, including we went to townships and we met people who sold LPG or propane out of their homes. So we kind of talked to a wide range of people. But one thing I don't want to oversell is my expertise on South Africa. So everybody else here knows a lot about South Africa, but I learned some really interesting things about the energy system, and I'm really excited to share those. So yeah, you can go to the first slide. So we've already kind of talked a little bit about this. So South Africa gets their electricity from coal, right? That's the gray area there. They get their electricity from coal, which before climate change, I mean, there was local pollution, but it was not unreasonable. They have tons and tons of coal. It was a very inexpensive way to power the system. But the problem is that of that gray area, half, 50% don't work. Half of the coal power plants in South Africa right now don't work because of lack of maintenance. And then I hear like rumors, sabotage. I didn't really understand what the sabotage thing was, but that's what people said. But a lot of just lack of maintenance. And so that's what's caused this crazy load shedding. And so in Cape Town, which is better than the rest of the country, it was every day, there was 1 to 2 outages of 2 to 4 hours. And so it's every single day. I was in a nice, fancy neighborhood. And so they had like batteries. So we had a couple lights, we could charge our phones. But if you're in the townships, you don't have these fancy appliances. And so it's a little bit of a hardship. So that's like the bad news, right? They use a lot of coal and it doesn't work anyway. So there's some good news, and you were kind of alluding to it. And that is that the people at Cape Town who do energy modeling, which is what I do, they have modeled it and they have shown that the least cost way forward in South Africa is solar and wind and a little bit of either gas or batteries, but basically solar and wind, okay? The least cost. So I'm not talking about climate change. I'm not talking about pollution. If we want to find the least cost way to get electricity to people, it's to use solar. So that's kind of fascinating. So we're talking about solar resource that's just amazing. So that's the good news. And that means the energy transition, in some sense, there's no trade-off in South Africa, right? It's like, everything goes in one direction. Let's use lots of solar and a little bit of wind. So that's the good news. There's a little bit of bad news, though, so go to the next slide. So in this slide, so hopefully I've got this right. So here, this is South Africa, and then the red, I think, is Johannesburg, more or less. And so here, this is coal country right here. It's a giant, there's tons of coal. It's like our Pennsylvania or whatever. That's coal country. And so the coal generators are all in coal country because it does not make sense to take coal and drive it somewhere. Instead, you generate the electricity and you transmit it. So here we have all of the coal generators in coal country. This is what I'm calling sun country, okay? Kind of right around here is the Kalahari Desert. This is basically a giant desert. There's lots of sun. There's, of course, ecosystems in the desert, but there's not a lot of competing land uses for people. So this is where you would put your solar to do this kind of least cost thing. So one problem is, though, if you go to the next slide, is the transmission system, okay? Because the generation is here, all the transmission starts here and goes out to where the people are, which, again, makes perfect sense, except when all of a sudden your generation is coming from here, there's no transmission. Now, people always say, oh, transmission is expensive. It's not really that expensive, okay? This least cost solution accounts for building this new transmission. So it's perfectly sensible and cost effective to build it. But this is where we come to Eskom. So Eskom is the state utility, state-owned utility. It is what's called a vertically integrated utility, which means that Eskom owns all the generation, the power plants, they own the transmission, and they own the distribution. That's the way all utilities were up until about 20 years ago. So they're bundled. Okay, so Eskom is the one who would build these transmission. But Eskom is so deep in debt. My understanding is they are never going to get out. So no one's going to loan them any money. If you loan Eskom money to build transmission, it's going down a black hole, right? It's not going to actually go to transmission. And so that's the bad news. So we have this beautiful solution, but we can't build the transmission because of Eskom. So one possible solution, I'd be interested to hear what people think, is what we've been doing in the US. You can unbundle these utilities or restructure them. You can spin off the transmission and make it its own company because the transmission is not in debt. It's the generation that's in debt. So you could unbundle it. They could get a loan, build the transmission, and we have a beautiful, clean, cost-effective future. So I'll leave it there. And then Léonce might tell us a little bit about why Eskom is so far in debt and some of the other issues around that. So thank you.
Thanks, Erin. And our fourth and last speaker is Léonce Ndikumana, who is Distinguished Professor of Economics here at UMass, where he also directs the African Development Policy Program at the Political Economy Research Institute. Léonce is also, along with yours truly, the co-editor of a recent book called On the Trail of Capital Flight from Africa, The Takers and the Enablers, and the South Africa chapter, which he co-authored. I had some copies of it back there. Some of you may have picked them up. There may be a few left, but it includes a section that deals specifically with ESCOM. Professor Ndikumana received his PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. He has served as Director of Operational Policies and Director of Research at the African Development Bank and as Chief of the Macroeconomic Analysis Division at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis. He's also an honorary professor of economics at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa and has written widely on multiple topics in African development, including work on external debt and capital flight, financial markets, growth and employment policies, and the economics of conflict and civil wars. So I'll turn it over to you, Léonce.
Thanks, everybody. I think I'm here because of Erin, because we met when we were doing a study on Ghana, on electricity, and then since then I follow her work, and here I am. So I'm not an expert on electricity, except as a user of electricity. I have been associated with South Africa for quite some time, having lived there for a year as on a sabbatical leave, but also I teach development. So that's one of the reasons why this is important. So I'll just say a couple of things to make the discussion confusing. Because in the end, I want to come back to very optimistic and productive way of looking at solutions that Erin engaged. So first of all, in terms of South Africa. South Africa is not the worst placed country in Africa in terms of access to electricity. It's going to sound very surprising. 86% of the population have access to electricity when it happens, relative to 51% in Sub-Saharan Africa, 8% in Sudan, 10% in Burundi. So if you're talking about issues of electricity, it sounds really strange that the first place to worry about will not be South Africa. Worry about Africa. Renewable energy electricity production in 2015 was 2.3%, now it's probably more, because at that time coal represented 97%, so it's probably a little bit more. But this is a country, when we think about just transition, we have to worry about other things. This is a country where 55% of the population was classified as poor in 2014, a little bit less now, but still, and unemployment 33%. Unemployment of the advanced with people advanced education is 16%. So we have to place this issue in the context of development. What are the developmental impacts of whatever solutions we make? Another, for 30 seconds, I want to bring out 3 anecdotes that illustrate my thing about this issue. One is there was a forum on Africa, and there was a discussion about by civil society organizations which were opposing the World Bank lending to South Africa to develop other coal powered plants. I was at the African Development Bank, and then so Minister Pravin Gordhan was in the room. So at the end, when it came to Q&A, he says, "Okay, so tell me, you're telling me that I should go back to South Africa and tell all those people who don't have access to electricity to wait until we discover cleaner energy so that they can see light." That was interesting. In Senegal, Bob Pauline and I were doing a workshop on inclusive finance, and there was a section where we talk about financing green economy. And at that time in Senegal, it had just discovered is a quotation mark, oil. And there was a big argument about keeping the oil in the ground, that's not good, and so on. And people were furious, okay? Last anecdote, when I was at the African Development Bank developing the energy strategies section, I almost got fired because me having my team put something about Africa considering nuclear energy as an option. Background of the energy power accident, what was that?
Fukushima.
Fukushima, yes. So I was told no nuclear energy in Africa, absolutely. At that time, France generated 52% of their energy from nuclear. What is a global context? So we have to ask ourselves, just transition from what? Is it from not having electricity to having electricity, or having coal-fueled electricity to clean energy, and how do we do that? Is it from transition from power generation owned and operated dominated by governments, state-owned enterprises, or foreign companies, or owned by national capital owners? Just in what sense? To the benefit of who? You talked about solar energy being concentrated in urban areas. I see that everywhere I travel. What about people who are working in those traditional sources of energy? What do we do with them in countries that are suffering from high unemployment? If you declare today that you close the power plant tomorrow, what happens with people who are getting their livelihood from those areas? And how do you finance that? Because granted, in terms of cost effectiveness, the traditional and the new ones are equal, but then you have to actually find new money to put in the new investment in the new power plants. At the same time, we're talking about a continent that it has a serious problem of keeping their own money. Here we have produced recently a book on capital flight. It's not new. It's Africa. South Africa is among the ones that are suffering the most. In this book, we estimate that over $300 billion went overnight from South Africa out of the world. And the second is, this money goes where? It goes in advanced economies, financial centers. Mm-hmm. The same places where we're looking for aid money to go finance these projects. So when you hear politicians talking about building walls to prevent immigrants from coming, how about building walls to prevent dirty money from coming from Africa to these countries? Because that money could finance the just transition. I think we have to change the debate about what is the priority for the world if we are thinking about doing a just transition that benefits everybody. First of all, that's doable in terms of financing, but also benefits everybody. The second issue is, who is going to manage that? Yeah. As Erin described, ESCOM is the one in charge of the energy sector, but ESCOM has failed completely. And it hasn't failed because of its own doing. It has been aided by a network of what we call enablers and takers in the private sector, colluding with the government sector. In this book, we have a nice chart that shows you a labyrinth of relationship between government officials, private operators, accounting firms, banks, and so on, all who are benefiting from scheming ESCOM by drawing contracts that are supposed to generate to provide coal to the unit, but coal doesn't arrive, but the money is paid. Mm-hmm. That's why ESCOM is indebted to the bonds. In the book, we look at ESCOM debt went from 106 billion rand to 400 billion in by 2019, which means that the company is financially not viable. So if you're going to build a structure for doing the transition, you cannot count on ESCOM the way it is now, because it's structured as a monopoly in the system. And every country I go through in African countries, Many countries have that system, and it becomes impossible to reform them because those who run ESCOM and those who benefit from ESCOM have interest in keeping the status quo.
Thank you.
That's how they make money. And for ESCOM employees and managers, that's also how they make money. There was a story somewhere that people were talking about reform and bringing in capital, private capital, which means you bring also private management. And some employees of that, I won't name the country, saying, if they do that, how do we build our houses? Meaning, how are we going to get the kickbacks from selling electricity and so on? So we have huge issues of financing. We have huge issues, issues of management and governance, but we also have a huge problem of global governance. Thank you. I can go into the details when we.
Well, thank you very much, all of you. A lot is on the table here, and I'd like to open it up for questions in just a moment. First, I'd like to bring out one or two things that came out of this discussion that really add a lot of context, I think, to that initial piece in the Financial Times that I mentioned, which was really about the problem of achieving two objectives, one of which was the green transition, and the second of which was a just transition in terms of the workers in the existing electric power sector. And I think it's become clear that there's a lot more to it. There's a justice problem not only involving who works, who gets jobs, but also who gets electricity. Across racial lines, spatial lines, between household sector and the mining sector, for example. There's a justice problem in terms of who gets the pollution generated by power production. And all of those complicate the story enough as it is. But then on top of that, you've got a third let's say, unspoken objective, which informs energy policy in South Africa, which is viewing the electricity generation system as in effect, a piggy bank from which to loot and extract resources which are drained out of the economy, very often back into the financial centers, as Léonce said. So you've got this other tacit objective there that in certain ways makes achieving any of the other objectives, even producing reliable electricity, let alone doing so in a green fashion, doing so in a just fashion, makes all of these things more difficult. So you have problems of law, you have problems of politics, you have problems of international relations and international finance. You've got a lot going on top of the engineering problems of how to generate power and distribute it. So with that canvas in mind, let me invite audience to ask questions or make comments.
You confused everybody, you see?
Well
Which is
done.
good.
Well
Which
done.
is good.
Yes, well done.
Don't raise your hand all at once.
I know these are very intimidating people.
Could I? Oh, okay. You've got one. Go.
My name is Ukasha. I'm a PhD student at the Building and Construction Department here in UMass. I'm not sure, maybe because I came late, some people might have talked about it, but when I heard Léonce speak, it really struck me with the concept of how we can keep the African money stay in Africa while we want immigrants to stay in Africa. What is the African Union actually doing about it? And has there been a chance for you to meet with African Union leaders?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to take a few questions around, or do we?
I think we can.
Okay.
We just take them one at a time.
Yeah. So thank you for the question. I think, as I said, my intention was to present this discussion in a broader context of development challenges that the continent is facing, but also the global context in which we operate and in which policies are made. When Jim Boyce and I started working on capital flight, Jim had started it a century ago. Before that, then we started.
He means in the 20s.
Yeah, at that time it was an exercise of development economists trying to talk about issues and so on. And I don't know if people are paying attention, but the rewarding thing about now is that I think the policy arena has picked up this issue of illicit financial flows, financial hemorrhaging of African countries. The UN has one of the targets of the SDGs is 16.4 is fighting illicit financial flows and the financing of terrorism. The African Union has this issue on among the top of its agenda because I think people understand that there is no point in going around looking for aid if your own money is heading where you're going. It actually goes before you. So it's not productive. But also the point we're trying to make now is that even for the donor countries, it's not helpful for them to take taxpayers' money, pretend to be sent, which is aimed to be sent to assist in developing other countries, but that money circles back in private pockets and private banks. It's not efficient, it's not fair. The UN Economic Commission for Africa based in Ethiopia has established a panel headed by former President Mbeki and other people who have been driving the debate on the dialogue on illicit financial flows and what to do about it. I find it productive. Some people are doing some interesting analysis, and we hope that this kind of discussions can feed into the making the point that it's not just about finance. These are not academics trying to figure out whether markets work and so on. And no, it's a serious development issue.
And it has a political dimension.
Yeah.
In South Africa, ESCOM was a part of the corporatist network that the apartheid governments and the segregation governments set up. The negotiated settlement did not do away with that. They couldn't. I remember I was in South Africa in 91 to 92, and I can remember as these talks were going on about making this transition, the national parties wanted to limit it to the question of voting, how many people could vote. They didn't want any other aspect of this discussion to come to the table. On the other hand, the ANC's hands were very much tied because they didn't have an alternative plan. And I can remember going into the government canteen, which is right next to the National Archives, and hearing Afrikaans-speaking bureaucrats saying, why do we have to negotiate with anyone? Our army is not in disarray. The administration is still intact. So why do we have to negotiate with anyone? And those kinds of ghosts, those kinds of skeletons in the closet are a big part of why things turned out as they did in South Africa, particularly after the beginning of deindustrialization in the mid-90s.
Jim, you want us to?
Oh, do you want
So
me
Joe
to
had
call
called
it?
and then Shabazz. Yeah, we can. Okay, so
you
Joe
can.
had her hand up first and then Shabazz after that, maybe?
Why don't you call
Okay.
Well, I was going to say that while I was listening to you talking and hearing more about kind of just all of it, right? Because there's so much different layers, not just in terms of energy. I was relating it back to home because I'm from the Virgin Islands, and you see so much parallelism in those cases of there is a layer of corruption, there is a monopoly in the energy system, which is creating this inequity. Even though the Virgin Islands is a predominantly Black place, you see access to renewable energy and solar power is really only for white suburbs and those communities. So you see all of this parallelism, and then the question becomes, where's the money going? There is money, it is a US territory, there is funding for the energy sector. Where is it going? Why is it not developing both the transmission system and, you know, what is WAPA owned by? Is it an independent entity? Is it under the government? Technically, it's part of the government, but not under the government. So who is really playing the biggest role of this, right? So I guess my question becomes is like, oh, and also we've gone to the shedding, the load shedding. Imagine this year we've gone back into it, and you know, after years, because now the generators just cannot support the demand that's currently in place. And this is for many other islands. I think Dominica has started as well. So it's just, I guess the question becomes, wait, there's so much layers and players in the game, you know, as both internal and external analyzers of it. What would you recommend be the focus as far as what's the first step? If you had to break it down by steps, we know that the technology is there, the energy is there, the opportunity is there. How exactly do you, I guess, start to shift the dynamic where we would be able to make impactful changes towards, you know, the direction of the energy sector that would be both equitable and just?
Try to answer that. Yeah.
It's a very loaded question and probably no one answer. So I'm just, you know,
I'll give my kind of non-answer that I like to give in general, which is that I think it's kind of the whole ETI thing, right? That there's not actually just one step. That's right. That we have to, there are people who are looking at technologies. There's people working with individuals. And so like in Puerto Rico, we're hoping to go to Casa Pueblo, where they're doing a very, you know, very community focused solar and all that kind of thing. Then there's people like Léonce who are trying to work with the finance. And so I think that, yeah, it's kind of a non-answer. I don't know if there's a first step, but I think all of us in this room, I guess that's my point, have a role to play. Like whatever we're doing, we actually all can do that to kind of lead towards. So that's my, if anybody wants to jump in.
I think that that's a good answer. I think of John Lewis and how he's quoted as saying, do everything, right? Like, you know, throw everything against the wall and see what sticks, right? And I think that that's true. Like these are sort of 360 problems. They require that we be putting everything into it. And so I do actually appreciate the fact that this conversation brings people together who are trying to tackle different parts of the problem, right? Different parts of the elephant, as it were. I mean, I guess part of what your question makes me think of, because for me, listening to Léonce, I was thinking, and to you, Erin, too, actually, I was thinking about the role of law. And I was thinking, okay, so when I think about the like structural needs of spinning part of ESCOM off, right, for the transmission piece, is that something that requires a policy intervention, like, or a legal, a legislative intervention, right? So I'm listening to you and thinking, okay, so what's our role as those people who are like advocating on the ground for legal and policy change, right? And then listening to Léonce, I'm also thinking about how, you know, international law and the global system has actually maybe even affected the terms that you were talking about that essentially shaped the transition from apartheid to democracy and limited the sort of economic transformation that was necessary to happen alongside the political transformation, right? And I'm thinking about how much was structural adjustment and how much is structural adjustment standing in people's minds as like, we don't want to do that to ESCOM because of like, you know, what has happened in the past when we have actually broken pieces up in order to avoid monopoly. And, you know, and we've basically ended up impoverishing a lot of countries, right? So there are all of these like political, economic, like developmental and legal dimensions that, you know, sort of frame the adaptive pieces of the technical like solution that's in place or that we have at our disposal, right?
Yeah, ultimately it's a political question.
All right, then Shabazz, you had a.
Thank you all for these presentations. There's a lot of thoughts going in our minds about very serious matters. I seem to recall a few years ago at COP26, the Just Energy Transition Partnership announced accepting South Africa as a partner, and that presumably this meant the mobilization of billions of dollars to assist South Africa in a just energy transition away from coal and to in a better direction. Is this dead in the water, or are things happening?
So when I was there, yeah, there was like the supposed money out there, but the money was not getting to where it needed to be. It wasn't clear to me exactly why. Like everybody was kind of like, oh, well, it's too much money and the communities don't know what to do with it. But you talk to other people that are like, the communities know what to do with this money. They're just not getting the money.
They're not getting the money.
Yeah, so there was just but the general impression was, it was like when you're sitting there, there was like this balloon, hanging right there of all this money that people have promised to South Africa. But my understanding is that little or none of it has actually come. And I don't know.
Does JETP offer no experience or resources or ideas to facilitate the change?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
I think that's a fundamental question, and it's related also to the question that our colleague from Visionarian was asking: what kind of steps? How do you see the process and so on? And mobilizing finance is a big issue, and South Africa is in a peculiar situation because it's a middle-income country. It does not get grants. It has to attract private finance or market-based, interest-based, what they call non-concessional loans. But those are based on very serious calculations about, is the money going to get to be used appropriately, because the investors have to see whether there is returns to be generated. And unless you then tackle the governance issue, you're not going to have people putting the money in the bucket. Because if they feel it's going to hand over to a company that has failed, they are not going to do it, even though in practice the returns may be appropriate. Then you have the issue of, because once you don't solve that issue, then you will have a big serious issue that even when the money is sent, it doesn't reach. So if I was to say what's the biggest, the hardest step to deal with is governance. I think there is money in the world. And even for small countries, less developed countries, when I talk, because I happen to be involved in negotiations between governments and private sector and so on, even in small countries, no resources, there is always interest in the private sector to invest. But people back off when they don't see exactly how the institutional environment is working, and because it's their money, they want to be able to be sure they get their money back. Now, for South Africa, from a positive side, I think if you look at the current government coalition, I think it gives hope that change can happen because of the power sharing and so on. And that, to me, that's a good thing. Meaning that this is the moment for these things to happen.
I fully agree about that. And it makes me think of something else I'd wanted to add earlier, which is, one of the things that is hopeful about South Africa, even in the midst of the picture that you painted, which is appropriate, right, around like the economic dynamics of like more than 55% of the population being technically classified as poor, and like 30% being unemployed, and that's just the technical, like the official rate of unemployment, right? Like we know that the real rate is much higher, and the category of people of the population that's most privy to unemployment is the youth, right? And people are really worried about their kids and their future, or not having a future, right? And so one potential intervention and one hopeful, I think, spark is that when you do have that degree of unemployment, you're not actually as much talking, or you're not just talking about transitioning people who were employed in coal power plants to being skilled in other ways. You're talking about people who just don't have a profession. Yeah. And so actually that is a strategically sensible intervention, right? Especially given the math that you were talking about, right? Like it makes sense to actually invest in skilling up young people to build up the solar and wind and, you know, like that energy, that just energy transition. And it just so happens that these industries are very like high labor industries. They actually like, you know, the jobs or a substantial proportion of the jobs continue, right? It's not like just investing and then leaving it. You actually invest and then you have to maintain. And so you actually keep people employed. So I think that that's one of the sparks of hope in South Africa and may actually, you know, we might get to a point where it's just a tipping point and you actually do just see it sort of fall into place. But the governance piece is very much a concern because
yeah, so like I say, that's just really interesting because I did hear that it was people, yeah, they weren't as worried about, so it was kind of the Financial Times. It wasn't what I was reading in this Financial Times article. People weren't that worried about the current jobs and reskilling people, but that is exactly, they're like, what we care about is the youth. And so when you make this transition, what we want to know is what are the careers of the future? And so I thought, again, that was interesting and fairly hopeful. So I think Oye had his hand first, and then there's a couple people. Go ahead.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Oye, PhD candidate at UMass, biomedical engineering. I'm Nigerian, but I lived in South Africa for about 7 years. So I just want to comment
Can you
and maybe
speak up just a little bit?
Oh, okay. So I lived in South Africa for about 7 years. So I just want to comment and maybe just ask a question. So from speaking to friends and also because, like I said, I lived there for a while, there's this policy, I don't know if anyone can comment on it, which is like the BEE, the Black-based, Black Empowerment, whatever. Yeah. I think for some reason, it sort of limits people from getting into business, for instance. So I remember speaking to a friend at some point that before you can own a company, no matter how small it is, even if it's a company of like 1,000 rand company, you probably need some racial identities within your company, like somebody who has to be a director from a white group, an Indian, or it's something like that. I think it sort of limits the old concept of energy, like the way people get into it. So, so you can imagine if you have like 60% representation, a Black representation in the company, they also need the government to finance them, right? If you really look at it. Now, they're already limited in that aspect. Now, if they now need 40% from other racial identities, how do they match that? But how do they even get people who is like sort of white who can actually invest in all those companies? I think there's sort of like so many policies mixing together. Like even like, for instance, I read something about 2 weeks ago, the Ramaphosa Economic Action Plan and all of that. It doesn't say all of these things because it's a proper stakeholder communication that from the bottom up, people need to understand, like, do I even have enough? Do I even have enough to invest in solar? Maybe just to power like a community. Like if I have that money, why do I need a white guy? I don't know, in the form of a question. I'm just thinking like the BE thing is a little bit like too complex. Even from an engineering point of view, you want to invest in like real estate, you already have that defense already. Like you can't do anything basically. You're powerless unless you really, really have somebody with the right, something else. My comment.
You want to come in or go down?
Well, I think one, there has to be a greater amount of state intervention in these matters. Because as long as these matters are settled by big corporate entities without any government intervention, the people who are most needy and who are most in need of some kind of change in their lives will not see it. I'll give you an example. The BMW plant that is presently in Spartansburg, South Carolina, used to be in East London, South Africa. In 2016, I met a person named Rudy Dutschke, who worked for Mercedes-Benz and BMW. And he was charged with creating a rapid adult basic education program in order to generate the 200,000 workers that the auto industry in South Africa would need to replace those people who were retiring, right? Clearly that did not work, right? Because the very plant that he was most focused on, the BMW plant in East London, is now in Spartanburg, South Carolina. So why is it that the ANC government, why did it not intervene in this process and rather than leaving it in the hands of a private foreign national, set of private foreign nationals to organize it? So it is a question of politics taking command in virtually all of the situations we have noted.
We could
Maybe one
have,
more comment, yeah.
We could have a longer discussion on BE. My sense is that, again, the kinds of arrangements you're talking about, I'm not familiar with them. But my sense is that the objective was to alleviate historical constraints that non-white communities face in access to capital. Because they don't inherit anything, they have no way to start, and the banking system is not interested in developing small medium enterprises. So that's the way I understood it. And one instrument which I would push for is developing specialized, boosting the capacity of specialized financial institutions like development banks, IDC, and all kinds of that. Because there is proven evidence historically in other countries that when you develop these kinds of institutions, you do promote access to finance, especially for small and medium enterprises. East Asian countries developed out of mainly from other things, but also from very good credit systems to targeted sectors. So, I mean, again, can talk more about
Can I just jump in really quickly to say, from a legal perspective, so it's been a while since I've engaged with that legislation, but my understanding is that your friend's understanding is actually somewhat inaccurate. And that actually is a reality sometimes, right? That like the policy, the government like structure has particular terms in place. And then like the popular understanding, right? Like, you know, the legal consciousness is different. And so I don't think that your colleague was constrained in the ways that they think they are, but that matters that they think they are, right?
Sure. That too. So we're almost out of time, but do you want to, next door, you quickly make your comment and then we'll move on after that.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Kiki, a PhD student in the ECE department. Some of my work looks at like barriers to energy access in sub-Saharan Africa, primarily in Uganda and Nigeria. And my question primarily goes to Erin and Sindiso. I think it is evident at the moment that trying to fix an energy system that was primarily built to serve a certain class of people isn't working. And from a finance perspective, Erin, you suggested breaking the vertically integrated approach so that we have a separate transmission to get finance for a system that will be heavily reliable on like sustainable options like solar, wind, and like just some and like the energy mix. So I think my question now is, how do we build this new system in a way that 50 to 100 years from now, we are not in this, like some other people are not in the same room having the same discussions around equity and justice, like these equity issues that we have, like how do we build this system?
Sorry, I have a question that it just builds on that, and I'll just add to that. It's really about the unbundling and seeing that unbundling has happened in other countries and knowing that when you unbundle generation from transmission, that does not necessarily guarantee that the system will work. So how can we assure that this new form of generation, like generation can also drive investment and not go into debt. And like, is there already policies, or are there policies in South Africa that promote private generation, and how can that integrate it to this new form of transmission system?
Yeah, so I don't know, like the long term, how we make sure that it's equitable. I think they allow private investment in generation. So we can get that solar again, because it's such a beautiful resource. I think people would build the solar there. So transmission, we have to figure out how to get that going. How to make that and keep that equitable and just is hard to say. And it was interesting what you were saying, because we also learned a lot about there's free basic electricity in South Africa, and yet a lot of people didn't understand it and thought you weren't allowed to use it if you used it. It was interesting. There was a lot of misinformation about it. So I mean, that's just one example. So I don't know. I just know that we could potentially, but it would be centralized, right? I mean, it's all in that one part of the country. So it's not like everybody owning their own generation, because that's a whole nother kind of way of looking at things. So
Can I say one thing?
yeah, one thing, and then we probably should, and then we can stay and discuss, but we should let everybody go when they want.
Yeah, I think that's the fundamental question. How do you do that? But I also, echoing what my sister has said, is you need to look at the legal and regulatory environment. For example, one of the constraints that one of the things that constrains transforming the energy sector is because of the history of monopolization of the sector by one entity, which is both an operator and a regulator, go figure, is because they want to impose on new operators their own rules. Example, the pricing system. Right now, if you look at most public utility companies in many countries, every kilowatt they sell is at a loss. And they don't care, they are public entities. Taxpayers are funding that. But they want then the new operators who are private to use the same pricing system. It does not work. So I think, again, you have to revamp the whole regulatory environment before you can entice people to come and operate in that thing.
Well, should we wrap it up?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, so we have got to 4 o'clock. I want to thank all 4 of our speakers for sharing their thoughts with us, and I want to thank all of you, especially all the people who asked such good questions. And yeah, there's a lot of work to do, folks. That's another part of the good news, I suppose.
That's right.
I'm in the SPS, I'm in the studies program. Yeah, we are.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to connect. It was really interesting, and I do think that there's a lot of.
You bet.
Yeah, we don't have anything to
Very nice to meet you.
Yeah.
A lot of really important aspects.
Want to come?
The last point.
That was awesome. I fabulous. Great presentation.
But I think that's because I think
Dialogue between